My name is Evelyn Carrington. I'm 67 years old. The air inside Savannah General smelled like antiseptic and peppermint hand lotion, the kind nurses leave out for volunteers. It was Christmas Eve. The corridors half lit, quiet except for the hum of the vending machine down the hall. I had stayed late to cover one last hour in the trauma ward, a habit I'd never quite shaken even after retirement. Some people collect porcelain angels. I collected long nights. By the time I hung up my volunteer badge, my feet ached in that deep, familiar way pain that didn't ask for sympathy, only acknowledgement. Outside, the wind carried salt from the marsh, and the parking lot glowed under strings of holiday lights someone had wrapped around the lampposts. My old Buick waited where it always did. Patient, silver, and dusted with a thin film of pollen that never seemed to leave, no matter the season, no matter. I leaned against the door for a moment before getting in, watching the hospital windows shimmer in the distance. Somewhere behind one of those panes, someone's Christmas was starting badly, and another's might not come at all. It made me grateful that mine, at least this year, was supposed to be simple. Dinner at my daughter's house, laughter, maybe a small argument over pie crusts, the kind that ends in a hug. I called her as I sat in the driver's seat, keys dangling from my fingers. The phone rang longer than usual before she picked up. "Hey, Mom," Marianne said, breathless, like she'd been running or maybe just busy. "You still at the hospital? Just left." I said, "I'm on my way. Should be there in 15. There was a pause too long to be casual. I could hear voices in the background. Music, the shuffle of plates. "Marianne," I said. She exhaled softly. "Mom, listen, things got a little mixed up tonight. We have so many people. Brad's parents came early, and his sister brought her fiancé." "That's fine," I interrupted. "I'll sit wherever, don't worry about it." Another pause. Sharper this time. "It's not that. It's just there's no room for you at the table tonight." The words came out flat, almost apologetic. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "What do you mean, no room?" I asked quietly. More background noise. Then her voice again, low and tight. "We didn't plan for this many. It's chaos. Maybe tomorrow morning we can—" I didn't let her finish. Something in me froze, not anger. Not yet just disbelief settling into the space where warmth should have been. I looked at the hospital across the lot, its lights soft against the fog. I'd spent the whole day tending to people who had no one waiting for them, telling myself I was lucky because I did. "Oh," I said finally. "All right. Mom, please don't take it." "It's fine," I said, cutting her off again, though my voice didn't sound like mine. "You have a full house. Enjoy it." I hung up before she could say another word. My hand trembled slightly as I placed the phone on the passenger seat. The radio came alive on its own. Static first, then Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. I turned it off. For a long minute, I just sat there, staring through the windshield at the faint line of oak trees swaying along Whitaker Street. The hospital clock struck 9. Someone in the distance set off a firecracker that cracked the air, too early and too loud. The smell of disinfectant still clung to my coat. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than I remembered, creased, gray-haired, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something else I couldn't name. I started the engine and eased the Buick out of the lot, merging into a stream of cars heading toward the glowing downtown. Windows glittered with wreaths and candles. And inside, people leaned close over dinners that smelled of cinnamon and roast ham. When I passed the corner where Marianne's street turned off, I slowed just enough to see the roofline of her house, warm light spilling from every window. I didn't stop. I kept driving until the lights disappeared behind the fog and the road narrowed toward the marsh. The house would be waiting quiet, cold, and honest. By the time I parked, the clock read 10. I sat there for a while, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, my hands resting in my lap. Then I opened the door and stepped into the damp night air. The sound of distant laughter carried faintly by the wind. Inside, the silence met me like an old friend. Patient and familiar, I hung my coat by the door and turned on the porch light. It glowed weakly against the fog, the only sign that someone was still awake. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang midnight mass, and I realized it was Christmas. I closed the door behind me and locked it. The streets of Savannah shimmered like a dream I couldn't quite enter. Every house I passed looked alive, windows glowing gold, silhouettes moving around tables, laughter spilling faintly into the night. Someone had lined their walkway with paper lanterns that flickered like little hearts beating against the dark. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, though they trembled now and then when the tires hit the uneven cobblestones. The Buick hummed softly, the only sound in a city wrapped in joy. I whispered to myself, "It's just one misunderstanding." The words felt small, too light to carry the weight they were meant to. The heater breathed warm air across my knees, but I couldn't feel it. My fingers were cold. Every block I drove took me farther from the hospital, farther from the place where I'd spent the day, saving strangers, and closer to the house where my own family had decided I didn't belong. Marianne's voice kept looping in my mind. "Careful and polite, Mom. There's no room for you at the table tonight." She'd sounded almost embarrassed, as if compassion were a luxury she couldn't afford with guests watching. I'd raised her to be kind, to look people in the eye when they spoke. Somewhere along the way, she learned to look past me instead. The stoplight at Whitaker and Gaston turned red. I braked gently, and for a moment, the car idled under a canopy of Spanish moss. The green strands swayed above the windshield, ghostly under the street lamps. When the light changed, I pressed the accelerator and drove on. Savannah at Christmas has a beauty that's hard to ignore, even when your heart's heavy. The historic homes, all porches and white columns, wore wreaths tied with red velvet ribbons. Families moved inside them like living ornaments. Fathers carrying toddlers on their shoulders, mothers clinking glasses in the dining rooms. I used to envy the sound of laughter that drifted through open windows. Tonight, I envied the silence that followed when doors closed. I turned onto Habersham, the shortcut I'd taken since I was a nurse rushing home after late shifts. The smell of rain rose from the pavement. Somewhere a radio played "O Holy Night," the notes fragile and far away. When I was younger, I used to tell myself that work was my anchor, that if I gave enough time, money, love, my family would always have a place for me, but giving had a way of turning invisible. The more I offered, the less they seemed to see it. A truck passed in the opposite lane, headlights cutting briefly through the car interior. For an instant, I saw myself in the rearview mirror, the tired woman gripping the wheel, her face mapped by years of holding everything together. My late husband, David, used to say I was made of quiet steel. He meant it as praise. Tonight, the quiet felt heavier than the steel. At the corner by the river, a group of carolers stood under a lamppost, scarves bright against the cold. One of them waved as I slowed at the sign, mistaking me for someone who might stop and listen. I nodded once and kept driving. When I reached the bridge that curved toward the marshes, fog gathered low over the water, turning the headlights into halos. My house was a few miles ahead, a small white cottage with peeling paint and a porch that leaned slightly to the right. It wasn't much, but it was mine, paid for one shift at a time. As I turned down the narrow road that led home, I noticed how the neighboring houses glittered with lights, porch bulbs glowing amber, Christmas trees pulsing in rhythm. My own driveway waited in shadow, the porch light still dark. I parked beneath the oak tree and shut off the engine. The sudden quiet was startling, like the moment a song ends before you're ready. Hey, I sat there for a while, listening to the tick of the cooling engine, the distant hum of laughter carried by the wind. My reflection stared back from the glass, pale and worn, but steady. I thought again of what I'd said in the car. It's just one misunderstanding, but the words, even whispered, didn't sound true anymore. The cottage waited in darkness when I pulled into the drive. The marsh behind the house shimmered faintly under the moon, reeds swaying in the wind like slow breathing. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. And for a moment the night felt endless. Just me, the fog, and the whisper of water moving through the grass. Inside, the air was cool and still. I set my keys on the counter and turned on the lamp by the window. Its light spread only as far as the small kitchen table where two chairs faced each other, one always left empty since David passed. Dust motes drifted through the glow, slow and unbothered. I put on the kettle out of habit. The faint click of the burner sounded louder than it should have. Usually by now I'd be at Mary Ann's house, laughing at her husband's bad jokes, watching my granddaughter unwrap a new doll. I'd have brought my pie pecan with bourbon glaze and pretended not to notice that no one touched it until dessert. Small traditions, small peace offerings. When the kettle whistled, I poured the tea and carried it to the table. I lit a candle, one of the cinnamon ones left over from last year, its scent spreading through the room like memory. From the pantry, I took a single plate, set out a slice of bread, and buttered it slowly. The knife scraped against the ceramic with a sound that made me flinch. The radio on the shelf blinked softly, waiting to be turned on. I reached for it, then stopped. I didn't want to hear Christmas songs. I didn't want to be reminded that the world outside was full of carols and laughter. Instead, I sat down and began to eat, each bite deliberate, as though chewing could keep me from thinking too much. The tea cooled before I finished it. The chair across from me was empty, but I could still see the ghost of movement the way David used to rest his elbows there, the way Mary Ann once dangled her feet from that seat as a child. Asking for just one more story. The silence felt heavier, because I could remember the sounds that used to live here. When the candle burned low, I leaned back and exhaled, the air trembling faintly in the light. Merry Christmas, Evie, I whispered to myself. The words landed in the quiet room and went nowhere. I let the candle burn until the wax spilled over its edge. A small river of gold on the tablecloth, then blew it out. Darkness folded around me again, gentle, absolute. I didn't sleep that night. The candle had long burned out, and the marsh outside the window had turned pale with dawn. I sat in the same chair, hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, the kind of silence that makes you remember everything you've tried to forget. Mary Ann's words still echoed somewhere behind my ribs, dull and stubborn. No room for you at the table, but memory has its own way of fighting back, dragging you to where the wound first started. For me, it began 40 years ago, in a different kitchen, with a baby asleep in a laundry basket because I couldn't afford a crib. David had been gone barely 2 weeks when I started my first double shift. He was 31 when the aneurysm took him quick, merciless, like the universe had turned a page mid-sentence. We had no savings. The hospital bills came faster than the sympathy cards. I remember standing at the sink after his funeral, sleeves rolled up, staring out the window at the neighbors' Christmas lights, thinking, all right, Evie, it's you now. So I worked. I worked until my feet went numb, until coffee became its own food group, until sleep felt like something only other people got to do. I would carry Mary Ann, barely 3 months old, to my mother's house before every night shift. Mama would take her with a sigh that sounded like pity wrapped in judgment. You should have chosen better. She'd say, you always want too much from life. I wanted only a roof and peace. Every month, I sent money to my parents. They never asked. They simply hinted. Your father's blood pressure pills are expensive. Mama would murmur. Or, we could use a little help fixing the porch. I always said yes. I told myself it was love. Later, I learned it was expectation disguised as affection. By the time Marianne turned 10, I'd worked my way from night nurse to trauma supervisor. My paycheck could finally breathe, but my life couldn't. On the nights I was home, she would fall asleep on the couch, waiting for me, small hand clutching the edge of her blanket. I used to sit beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, whispering apologies she couldn't hear. At school events, I stood in the back, too tired, too plain among the polished mothers who didn't smell like antiseptic. Marianne once asked me not to wear my uniform to her class play. "It smells like the hospital," she said softly. I didn't blame her. No child wants to be reminded that love comes with a price tag of exhaustion. When she went off to college, I thought things would get easier. But the bills kept coming, and the old habits followed. My parents retired early without savings. "You're the strong one," Mama said over the phone. "You'll manage." She'd been saying that my whole life, as if strength were infinite, as if it refilled like water when poured out. Every Christmas, I sent gifts I couldn't afford, bought new shoes for my father when his fell apart, helped Janine, my sister, with her rent after her divorce. And when Marianne needed a down payment for her first house, I signed the check without a second thought. I don't remember anyone ever saying thank you. Not really. Gratitude was assumed, like breathing. Still, there were moments when I felt proud watching Marianne graduate, standing beside her in photos where I looked worn, but content. For years, I believed love was measured by how much you gave before being asked. But somewhere along the way, giving turned into something quieter, emptier. My mother once told me, kindness only counts when it doesn't inconvenience anyone. I didn't argue then. Now I think that's the kind of belief that kills families softly. By the time I reached my 60s, strength wasn't a virtue anymore, it was a service. My parents depended on me. My sister called when things broke. And Marianne, sweet girl that she once was, learned that her mother could be both invisible and reliable at the same time. She inherited my work ethic, but none of my stubborn softness. She built a life surrounded by people who taught her that appearance mattered more than effort. I stared at the gray light edging through the window. The marsh outside stirred, the wind moving through the reeds like voices overlapping. I thought of all the Christmas mornings spent in scrubs, slipping into the hospital before sunrise while others unwrapped gifts. I used to tell myself it was worth it, that every sacrifice would one day circle back as gratitude. But sitting there in the half-light, I finally understood what had been waiting for me all along: love that had turned practical, practical that had turned thankless. And in the space where music should have been, I felt the weight of every quiet yes I'd ever given. The morning after Christmas broke gray and slow. Light pressed weakly through the curtains, and the house smelled faintly of burnt candle wax and cold tea. I hadn't slept. Instead, I'd sat in my robe until dawn, listening to the soft groan of the marsh wind against the windows. It was the kind of quiet that made you believe the world had already moved on without you. My phone was on the counter, blinking with notifications, messages from old coworkers, a few holiday texts from neighbors, and one from my sister. "Janine, hope your night was peaceful. Ours was wild attached," was a photo. I opened it without thinking. The image filled the screen, my mother's dining room glowing under soft yellow light. The long table set with china I'd bought her years ago. 27 people crowded around it, my parents at the center, Janine on one side, her boys at the far end, and Marianne beside her husband, Brad, even the neighbor. Mrs. Quinn, who lived across the street, had made it. She was in the corner, holding a plate of pie, grinning as if she'd been part of the family forever. They all looked radiant. Plates gleamed with roast turkey. Crystal glasses caught the reflection of garland lights. Everyone seemed at ease, heads tilted in laughter, forks halfway to their mouths. It was a portrait of warmth, belonging, celebration, except there was no space left on that table for me. Not even an empty chair. I stared at the photo until the shapes blurred. For a moment, I tried to tell myself maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe the photo had been taken after dessert. Maybe someone had already left. But there it was. In the corner of the frame, the full table. Chairs filled, the polished wood unbroken by a single gap. I zoomed in. Marianne was smiling, her hand on her daughter's shoulder. My granddaughter, little June, wore the red velvet dress I'd sent 2 weeks earlier. I remembered wrapping it, smoothing the tissue paper, slipping in a note that said, "For Christmas morning, love, Grandma Evie." They hadn't even tagged me. A line of comments followed below. "What a beautiful family. Looks perfect. So cozy." Ruth, that one from an old family friend, directed at my mother. She'd replied with a heart emoji and nothing more. I felt the breath leave me, slow and steady, like air escaping a punctured tire. It wasn't just the absence, it was the ease of it. They looked too comfortable, too practiced in pretending I didn't exist. I set the phone down, but the image lingered behind my eyelids. It was a still life of everything I'd given and everything they'd erased the mortgage I'd helped pay. The holidays I'd hosted when Mama's back went bad. The hours I'd traded for their comfort. In that photo, none of it mattered. I walked to the sink and let the tap run, waiting for the sound of water to drown the thoughts building in my head. But the photo was burned there now, bright and cruel. When the water overflowed, I shut it off. My reflection wavered in the window above the sink, pale, tired. Wearing the same robe I'd worn when I used to stay up late, waiting for Marianne to come home from high school parties. I remembered her promises, the ones she made at 19, when she said she'd never forget everything I'd done for her. "You're my home," she'd whispered. Somewhere along the line, that promise had turned into a convenience. I dried my hands and picked up the phone again, scrolling through the comments one last time. Janine had added another post. "Family means everything." A dozen people had liked it, including Marianne. I locked the screen and set the phone face down. The silence felt heavier now, not just around me, but inside me, stretching into every corner of the house. Outside, a heron cut through the fog over the marsh, wings so deliberate. I watched it until it disappeared into the pale sky, leaving only ripples in the air, proof that something had moved, even if it couldn't be seen anymore. By noon, the sun had burned through the fog, and the marsh behind my house glistened with light that made everything look cleaner than it felt. I opened the windows, let the air in, and tried to keep busy. Washed the single plate from last night, folded the throw blanket on the couch, swept the kitchen floor, though it didn't need it. The body knows what to do when the mind can't rest. Still, every motion tugged at something old. The photo from Facebook clung to me like static. Every smile in it rehearsed, polished, perfect. It wasn't the first time I'd been edited out of a picture. It just happened digitally now. My mother, Lucille, used to curate family moments the way museum curators arrange displays, everything polished, nothing out of place. She had a way of making life look orderly from the outside, even when the inside was cracking. I used to think it was pride. Now I know it was fear of judgment, of imperfection, of being less than the family next door. Lucille was never loud. She didn't have to be. She ruled with a glance, a sigh, a pause that lasted half a breath too long. When she said, "Family isn't about comfort, it's about order," she meant that appearances mattered more than affection. As long as everyone smiled at church, no one cared who cried at home. I learned early that love was conditional. If you brought home good grades, you got praise. If you didn't, you got silence that felt worse than shouting. When my father lost his job, she told him, "You'll still shave every morning. We don't air our failures." When I got my first nursing scholarship, she said, "Don't brag. It makes others uncomfortable." There was always a reason to be smaller than my success, quieter than my pain, for years. I mistook her control for care. Even when I became a mother, I still tried to earn her approval. I sent her photos of Marianne's school awards, her recitals, her prom dress. Lucille would respond with a short note. "She's lovely. Don't let it go to her head." And somehow, even from miles away, she managed to plant that same logic in Marianne. When my daughter was little, she adored her grandmother, the pearls, the perfume, the soft way she said her name. Lucille would take her shopping for dresses I couldn't afford and come home with matching smiles, arms full of packages. At first, I was grateful. It felt like the bond I never had with my own mother. But love from Lucille always came with fine print. She'd lean down to Marianne and say, "Your mother's too practical. Darling, she doesn't understand grace." And then she'd turn to me with a smile that said, "You're welcome." That's how it starts, the quiet rewriting of who you are until even your child begins to see you differently. By the time Marianne reached high school, she'd inherited my mother's tone, gentle, dismissive, polite cruelty wrapped in civility. When I couldn't attend a school event because of a night shift, she said, "It's okay. Grandma always comes anyway." When she got married, she seated Lucille at the head table and me beside the catering staff. I never corrected her. I told myself it wasn't worth the scene, that she'd understand one day. But one day never came. After my father's death, I offered to move Lucille into my home. She refused, claiming my house was too plain, too far from her friends on Whitaker Street. "You have your work," she said, "and I have my standards." It stung then, it stings even now. Looking back, I realize Marianne absorbed that same language refinement over warmth, appearance over feeling. She doesn't scream, doesn't curse, doesn't even lie. She simply edits, trims, and rearranges until her version of love looks spotless. When she told me there was no room for me at her table, I heard my mother's voice echoing through hers, cool and composed. Family isn't about comfort, it's about order. Outside, the wind caught the porch chime, a hollow sound like something breaking politely. I stood at the sink, staring at the glass in my hand, and thought how easy it is for one generation to hand down pain disguised as decorum. I always promised myself I'd raise my daughter differently. I gave her freedom, choices, a voice, but maybe that was never enough. Maybe the quiet lessons, the ones whispered in lace and perfume, sink deeper than any I ever taught. And now, all these years later, I see it clearly: my mother's table, my daughter's table, both perfectly set, perfectly shining, and neither with a seat for me. The kitchen was still, lit only by the glow of the small lamp on the counter, outside. The marsh mist pressed against the windows, curling around the porch like it was listening. I sat at the table, hands folded over a blank sheet of paper, and let the quiet settle around me. It wasn't emptiness, I felt it was anticipation. Like a storm paused just beyond the horizon, I picked up a pen, one with smooth ink that glided easily over the page. The first words came slowly, each one measured, deliberate. "You said there was no room for me at your table." I paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. It felt too soft and too sharp at once, a paradox that mirrored the whole night. For decades, I had been giving, bending, waiting. I had smoothed every wrinkle in my family's lives, paid for their comforts, absorbed their small cruelties. And now, at 67, I realized giving alone hadn't built any bridges. It had built dependence. The pen moved again. "After this winter, there will be no roof of mine over yours." The words felt heavier when I read them aloud in the silence. Not anger, not revenge, just truth, stripped to its bare form, clinical and unyielding. It was a boundary drawn with ink, precise as a surgical incision. I pictured their reactions, the pause in Lucille's measured tone, the flicker of recognition in Marianne's eyes. I imagined the weight of this letter resting in their hands, their morning shaken before coffee could settle in their veins, and I did not flinch at the thought. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the quiet swell of power that comes from knowing your own mind and refusing to be bent by the expectations of others. Every sentence, every comma was deliberate, a careful architecture of clarity and certainty. I wasn't writing to hurt them. I was writing to protect myself, to define the limits of what I would carry any longer. I folded the letter slowly, aligning the edges, making sure the crease was straight. It felt like folding a piece of myself into a form that could travel across streets and reach the family that had forgotten how to treat me as anything more than a convenience. I slid it into an envelope, the flap sealing with a soft press of my thumb. There was a small sticker I had used for years on holiday letters, a simple gold star, and I pressed it over the seal. Even now, I cared enough to mark it with care. This was not chaos. It was order. Sitting back, I let the pen rest on the table and traced the edges of the envelope with my fingertips. The room felt heavier, charged with expectation, yet calm. For the first time in a long while, I was not trembling with grief or confusion. I was steady. I was deliberate. I set the envelope near the edge of the counter, ready for the drive tomorrow morning. I could hear the faint croak of a heron in the distance, wings stretching through the fog, moving with purpose. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The night was still, the marsh was quiet, and somewhere deep inside me, grief began to settle into resolve. For the first time, I understood that justice does not need to shout. It can be gentle, it can be quiet, and still, it can be absolute. The sky was a deep, inky blue when I pulled the Buick out of the driveway. Mist clung to the marsh, curling around the tall grasses like smoke, and the first hints of morning were only just beginning to pale the horizon. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me, heavy with intent. Whitaker Street was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the car windows and made every sound sharper, the distant rustle of leaves, the hum of a lone street lamp, the faint scuff of tires on wet pavement. Houses stood in orderly rows, wreaths on doors, holiday lights blinking gently. Families still asleep, their windows dark except for a sliver of glow from night lights or the fading embers of last night's fires. I drove slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of each moment. The letter seemed heavier with every block, though the paper hadn't changed. You said there was no room for me at your table. After this winter, there will be no roof of mine over yours. The words were sharp, yet calm, measured. The edges of grief cut cleanly into ink. When I reached their house, I parked in the shadow of the oak tree, engine ticking as it cooled. The fog thickened here, turning the porch light into a muted halo. Outlining the wreath on the front door, I stepped out, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. Cold air filled my lungs, clear and bracing. The envelope felt solid in my hands. A tangible weight of years, of unnoticed effort, of quiet patience that had finally hardened into resolve. I slid it beneath the wreath, tucking it carefully so it wouldn't blow away in the morning breeze. There was no knocking, no announcement, no prelude, just the letter, resting there like a small challenge, silent and deliberate. Church bells rang faintly in the distance, their notes diffused through the fog, lingering like ghosts. I let the sound follow me back to the Buick, chest tightening, not from fear, but from the quiet satisfaction of action finally taken. I didn't look back, didn't linger, because the purpose had been served, the message was delivered, and the power I had felt slipping through the years began to return in small increments. I eased the car down the street, leaving the house in shadow, and the fog swallowed the taillights. The envelope waited for them, patient, inevitable, and entirely in my control. By the time I turned onto the main road, the first blush of sunrise began to tint the edges of the sky. I could feel the quiet settling over me. Heavy, but certain, action had replaced helplessness. Silence had been made audible through ink, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like justice, even without anger, even without confrontation. The marsh stretched out beside me, still and reflective, and I let the Buick glide forward, carrying me home into the faint, promising light. Chapter 9. The morning after I woke to the insistent vibration of my phone against the counter. Outside. The marsh was pale gold in the early light, mist curling over the water in delicate layers, but the serenity of dawn had nothing to do with the storm waiting in my kitchen. I leaned over, picked up the phone, and saw a screen full of notifications calls, messages, alerts stacking higher than I cared to count. The first call I answered was my mother, Lucille. Her voice came through loud, raw, and furious. "You've lost your mind," she shouted before I could speak. The words cut through the quiet house like a whip, making the air tremble. I could hear my father murmuring behind her. "Lucille?" Calm let her speak. But she ignored him completely, her tirade rolling over him like a tide. "I haven't lost my mind," I said calmly. "I just delivered a message you needed to hear." A hiss of anger followed. "A message. You threaten us in the middle of the night after everything we've done for you. You think this is justice. You're cruel, Evelyn." I didn't answer further. Her voice rose behind me, echoing in the small house, bouncing off walls that had absorbed years of quiet endurance. The fury was almost mechanical, rehearsed, perfected over decades of disappointment and control. Before I could put down the phone, another alert appeared. Janine. My sister's tone was sharp, cutting. "How dare you do this? You're cruel, completely cruel. This is beyond anything I thought you capable of." I scrolled through more messages, friends, relatives, even a neighbor forwarding gossip. Not one asked why I had written the letter. Not one paused to consider its contents. The focus was entirely on my behavior, the breach of their expectations. I set the phone down, letting it vibrate through the morning light. My hands were steady, though my chest felt tight with the residual heat of sleep and the ache of remembered injustice. I didn't pick the phone up again. I didn't reply. I simply walked to the porch, the wood creaking beneath my slippers, and leaned on the railing. I closed my eyes, inhaling the damp, briny marsh air, and whispered, "Now you know what it feels like." The words lingered, pressing back across the distance to the street where my parents lived, where Mary Ann might be watching the consequences unfold. I pictured them reading the letter, the ink holding its lines with absolute certainty, the precision of every sentence. It was not spite. It was clarity, leaving no room for misinterpretation. For the first time in decades, the scales had shifted. I was no longer the one who gave endlessly while waiting in silence. I was no longer the quiet audience to their judgments, the invisible fixture in the background of their lives. I had carved out a space that belonged only to me, and for the first time, they could feel the emptiness they had imposed. I lingered, watching the fog rise from the marsh, imagining the ripple of unease moving through their morning. I could almost hear Lucille clutching the envelope, stiff from the night air. Realizing I had acted without fury, without performance, and without melodrama. The quiet precision of leaving the letter, driving away, Ignoring their calls, it was weight she could not command, consequence she could not erase. The first calls had been shrill and urgent. As the morning unfolded, they became frantic, almost unhinged. Texts all caps, exclamation points. Desperate pleas, each one landed like a note in a symphony I was no longer part of. The discordant melody of those who believe the world owes them acknowledgement for acts they never performed themselves. I didn't move from the porch. I let the sun climb higher, fog dissipate, marsh quiet beneath it. Somewhere far away, I imagined Marianne reading the letter again, perhaps noticing for the first time the weight of a mother's resolve, the finality of carefully chosen words, the knowledge that she had, however unknowingly, inherited lessons from her grandmother. Polished cruelty wrapped in civility was implicit in every line. I touched the railing lightly, feeling the rough grain beneath my fingers. I could have answered the phone, justified myself, explained, softened the edges of my action, but I did not. This morning was not for explanation or reconciliation. It was for understanding that, when the scales are reversed, the absence of presence speaks louder than any shout. With the sun burning through the mist, I understood that justice, wielded deliberately, does not need to shout. It only needs to exist. I turned back toward the kitchen, glanced once at the empty chair beside the counter, and felt, for the first time in many years, the weight of balance settling softly into the room. I was no longer the one left out. They were. Chapter 10. The knock at my door. The morning stretched slowly across the marsh, golden light pressing through the windows, when a sharp, deliberate knock broke the calm. I had just poured coffee into my chipped mug, the one my mother always despised, when I heard the hurried footsteps on the porch. I knew them instantly. Lucille. I opened the door before she could knock again. She stood there in her robe, hair disheveled, fury radiating off her like heat from an open flame. The familiar scent of her perfume sweet, overbearing, lingered in the cold air. "You ungrateful woman," she hissed. "After everything we've done for you." I leaned against the doorframe. "Calm, Mama," I said evenly. "I gave you a house. You gave me silence." Her eyes flickered, just briefly, before she straightened, robe snapping in the wind. "You delivered that letter in the middle of the night, threatening us. What did you hope to accomplish?" "Not a threat," I said. "The truth. I don't need to yell for it to matter." Her lips pressed together, sharp and bloodless. "You will take it back," she ordered, her voice dropping into that controlled, theatrical tone she used to command obedience. "I will not," I said softly. I said what needed to be said. "The letter stays where it was placed." She reached into her pocket, pulled out the crumpled envelope, and tore it in half. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. "You will not do this to me," she barked, holding the halves like proof of victory. I didn't flinch. "You can rip the paper," I said, "but not the meaning." Her face twisted, caught between outrage and disbelief. "You think you can treat your family this way and walk away unscathed? I'm not treating anyone," I replied, voice steady. "I'm simply refusing to be treated as less." She took a step closer, pointing a trembling hand at me. "We gave you life, Evelyn. We raised you. You owe us respect. I owe you honesty," I said. "And honesty is all that's left." And honesty, for a moment. Silence stretched between us, thick, brittle. She looked down at the torn pieces in her hand, then dropped them on the porch. Her expression faltered, confusion softening the edges of her rage. I could see it then, the realization that the performance had ended, that I was no longer her audience. I stepped back and closed the door slowly. She didn't move right away. Through the glass, I watched her stand there, robe tugged by the breeze, muttering to herself before turning toward the street. The gravel crunched beneath her slippers as she disappeared into the fog. The torn letter lay on the porch. Faint gold seal still clinging to one half. It didn't matter. The message had already taken root. Inside, the house felt lighter, the air clearer. I set my mug on the counter and poured another cup of coffee, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The morning sun reached across the floorboards, soft and forgiving. For the first time in my life, I felt the boundary between us hold firm. The child in me was quiet now, no longer seeking approval. The woman remained steady, resolved, and finally, unafraid. I drove through Savannah in the quiet of late morning, the Buick gliding over the familiar streets, fog lifting to reveal brick sidewalks glinting with frost. My mind ran over the steps I had taken the night before, the way the envelope had rested beneath the wreath, the slight weight of inevitability it carried. Each repetition only strengthened the resolve I had felt in my chest, the resolve to end the years of quiet exploitation once and for all. Nathan Crowley's office was tucked into a narrow side street near Broughton, an old brick building with green shutters. The door chimed faintly when I entered. Nathan looked up from his desk, glasses slipping slightly down his nose, hair still tousled from a morning run. He was the kind of lawyer who could have been intimidating if he wanted, but in the decades I had known him, he had always approached both law and friendship with quiet precision. "Evelyn," he said, voice low but steady, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." I did, placing my coat on the back of the chair. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a calm that seemed almost foreign after the storm of the last 24 hours. Nathan pushed a manila envelope across the desk toward me. Inside were the eviction notices, carefully drafted, legally sound, each word chosen to avoid ambiguity. "This is it," he said. His finger traced the lines, the names, the dates. "Once these are filed, it's final. There's no pulling them back without your consent." I nodded, feeling the weight of every year settle like sediment in my chest. "I understand." Nathan hesitated, his gaze lingering on me longer than necessary. "You're sure you can live with it?" His question wasn't rhetorical. He knew the family dynamics, knew how deeply entrenched the patterns of loyalty, guilt, and resentment ran. He knew that blood ties, once disturbed, could fracture into something irreparable. "I've lived with worse," I said. The words were firm, almost cold, but they carried the truth of decades spent carrying burdens not my own. I had watched my parents' quiet manipulations, absorbed Janine's small betrayals, endured the lessons Marianne had learned without question. I had survived nights alone, mornings watching her childhood milestones through the lens of distance and obligation. And now, at 67, I was claiming the one piece of power I had left. Nathan exhaled slowly and slid the papers toward me. "Then let's make it official." I signed each notice carefully, the pen gliding across the page, each signature a small declaration of autonomy. When the last line was complete, I leaned back in my chair and looked at Nathan. "Send them. Make sure they understand the timeline, the terms, everything in writing." He nodded, tapping a few keys on his keyboard, printing additional copies, stamping each one. The process was precise, methodical, almost soothing. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, no drama, just the finality of ink on paper, a tangible assertion of control. "You're certain about this?" Nathan said again, softer this time, almost as if speaking aloud to himself. "I am," I replied. My eyes met his, steady. It's time they felt the weight of consequence instead of the weight of my patience. He leaned back, folding his hands on the desk. "Then it's done. You'll receive confirmation once it's filed, legally. This is ironclad." I nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling into my chest. The papers might have seemed simple to an outsider, but each one carried years of endurance, patience, and restraint. With them, I was no longer the one bending to their expectations, no longer the invisible caretaker of grievances and obligations that were never mine to bear. As I stood to leave, Nathan gave me a small, approving nod. I returned it, feeling the gravity of finality like a tide settling against the shore. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting gold across the streets of Savannah. And for the first time in decades, I felt the beginning of clarity. The decisions were made. The steps were irreversible. And in that quiet, calculated certainty, I finally felt a measure of peace. By mid-morning, my inbox looked like a battlefield. Messages stacked on top of one another, some short, some long-winded, but all with the same undertone outrage. "You only get one mother," one cousin wrote. "Another, Evelyn. How could you do this to your parents?" Think of Marianne. The notifications kept coming, each ping echoing louder than the last. I scrolled through them without surprise. These were the voices of people who had never paused to ask why, who assumed their version of loyalty was universal, and whose judgment required no context. I paused on a message from Janine, her tone desperate. Clipped. Accusatory. "You're tearing the family apart. Stop this. Now." I didn't reply immediately. I let my thumb hover over the keyboard, thinking about the years of quiet work, of unseen sacrifices, of patience that had been met with disregard. Then I typed a simple line to one cousin who had asked for clarification. "Then I hope you treat yours better than I was treated." It wasn't a threat, nor an invitation. It was a statement of fact. Next, I attached screenshots carefully selected. Chronological, neat. Every bill I had paid for 14 years, utilities, mortgage, dental plans, doctor visits, repairs. Each one carried its own weight, its own evidence of commitment that had been ignored, minimized, or treated as entitlement. I sent them and leaned back in my chair, letting the faint light from the window warm my face. The messages continued to arrive, a steady rhythm of outrage, concern, and disbelief. None asked, "Why now? Why this action?" None acknowledged the years of quiet compliance that had led to this moment. The weight of their judgment landed on me, but it did not shake me. For the first time, I felt fully isolated in my authority. No one could interpret my actions without confronting the evidence. The undeniable record of care that had been met with disregard, the storm outside the wind rattling the eaves, the occasional squawk of a heron over the marsh mirrored the storm in my inbox. And yet, in that chaos, there was clarity. I did not reply to most of the messages. I let them sit, unread, pending the moment when they would have to acknowledge not just the letter, but the life behind it. The family's assumptions, their moral outrage, their sense of entitlement, it all hovered, waiting to meet the truth. The one thing they could not edit away. The house felt heavier that afternoon, though the marsh outside caught the sunlight in pale, glimmering streaks. I had spent the morning sorting through messages, screenshots, and reminders of years I had given without pause. The storm of my family's outrage had quieted somewhat, leaving only the echo of unanswered questions and the persistent hum of the refrigerator. Marianne hadn't called, not once. The silence was sharp, cutting through the small rituals of my day. Tea cooling in its mug, the sweep of the broom over the kitchen tiles, the mail stacking neatly by the door. I replayed our last conversation over and over in my mind, the careful way she had said, "There's no room for you at the table." The faint hesitation in her voice that suggested she didn't fully understand the weight of what she was doing. I wondered if her actions were born of cruelty or of habit, the echo of lessons learned from a grandmother who measured love in convenience and order. Was it the inherited precision of her upbringing? Or had she chosen this course herself? I couldn't tell. And that uncertainty pressed down on me harder than anger ever could. Hours passed. I tried to occupy myself folding laundry, rinsing dishes, checking the mailbox, but the quiet pulled my attention back. Over and over. I thought of the evenings I had spent beside her crib, the winters I had spent driving home from the hospital to tuck her into bed, the countless moments when I had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and personal joy for her well-being. None of it had prepared me for this silence, this space that felt like a wall between us built overnight. Then, late in the afternoon, my phone vibrated. I picked it up and saw her name on the screen. A single text, "I just need space." I stared at it for a long time. The words suspended on the screen as if they carried more weight than their brevity suggested. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have typed more. Tried to explain, to bridge the gap with a flurry of reassurances or pleas, but I didn't. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that motherhood sometimes demands letting go before love can endure. Finally, I typed one word. "Take it." I pressed send and set the phone down. The sunlight shifted, warming the floorboards. And for a moment, the room felt lighter, not because the tension had gone, but because the act of acceptance had carved out a small measure of peace. I could not control her feelings, her decisions, or her responses, only my own. I sank into the armchair by the window, hands folded over my lap. The marsh shimmered in the late light, and I let myself breathe, steady and deliberate. Love, I realized, does not always mend what is broken. Sometimes it waits, quiet and patient, giving space for healing that might not come on anyone's timetable, but its own. The knock at the door came late in the afternoon, sharp and uneven, like someone who had been pacing for hours. I set down the laundry I had been folding, the scent of detergent still clinging to the freshly pressed towels, and walked to the door. Janine stood there, hair tangled and pulled back hastily, robe twisted around her like she had rushed straight from bed. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes wide and frantic. "Evelyn," she said breathlessly, "they're driving me insane. You have to help." I looked past her to the gray light of the marsh outside, letting it settle over the porch and the quiet house behind me. Inside, I had spent the last few days organizing, breathing, and reminding myself that I would not be dragged back into the chaos that had defined our family for decades. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said softly. But without invitation beyond the threshold, she shuffled into the kitchen. Muttering under her breath, tugging at the folds of her robe, she sank onto a chair, hands wringing in her lap. Mom refuses to listen. Dad keeps repeating himself, and they're fighting nonstop. The house. It's impossible. I can't live like this. You have to intervene. Please. I continued folding laundry, setting the towels in neat stacks on the counter. Each movement was deliberate, slow, deliberate in a way that contrasted with her jittering energy. "No, Janine," I said without looking up. "You helped them push me out. Now you live with them." She froze, her shoulders hunching as if she had not expected a response like that. I didn't mean to." "You did," I said, folding the final towel and placing it on the stack. "Every time you excused their cruelty, every time you whispered reassurances instead of checking the facts, you participated. You reinforced the patterns. You've seen them for years, and now this fire has reached your door. You live with it. You see the consequences you chose." Her lips pressed tight. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, but no words came. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I carried the laundry basket to the bedroom, placing it neatly on the bed, then returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. She sat there, flushed and muttering, realizing that the patterns she had participated in had not spared her from their weight. Finally, she rose, tugged the robe around her shoulders, and muttered, I understand. It was the first hint of accountability I had heard from her in decades. She did not ask for forgiveness, nor did I offer it. She walked to the door, paused, and left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. The cool wood steady beneath my back. The quiet settled again, carrying with it a lesson that fire, once lit, can't be directed by anyone but those who tend it. Months passed, and the tension that had built over the winter slowly shifted into resolution. The house on Whitaker Street, the one I had bought for my parents all those years ago, finally sold. I watched the closing process unfold with a sense of quiet detachment. The same calm that had guided me through the letter, the confrontations, and the legal filings. Each signature, each stamped document, felt like the measured exhale of a burden I had carried too long. The buyer was a young couple relocating from Charleston, drawn to the historic charm and the carefully preserved details of the home. They wanted vacant possession, and the paperwork confirmed it. My parents and Janine had no choice but to move out, leaving behind the life they had taken for granted, the rooms that had once been filled with their expectations and entitlement, now empty and silent. I transferred part of the proceeds into a small college fund for Marianne, a quiet measure of care, regardless of whether she would ever acknowledge it. It was her future, her opportunity, a seed planted with the same care I had given her all her life, but without strings, without expectation. The act felt right, steady, deliberate, the kind of gesture that neither seeks approval nor demands gratitude. That night, I stepped onto the porch of my own home. The marsh stretched before me, gray and silver under the thin fog, reeds bending gently in the evening air. The mist curled around the water like slow smoke, curling and drifting, shifting with each breeze. I leaned against the railing, the wood cool and steady beneath my fingers, and let the silence settle into the spaces that had once been occupied by worry, obligation, and the constant hum of family demands. The house was finally mine, not just in ownership, but in peace. No one could intrude uninvited. No one could manipulate the rhythms of my days. And no one could remind me that my worth had ever depended on their approval. The closing of that door, the finality of the sale, felt like a quiet affirmation I had chosen my boundaries, upheld them, and survived the storm intact. I sipped my tea slowly, the warmth seeping into my hands. The fog rolled over the marsh, thickening in patches and thinning in others, shifting like the years I had spent waiting, enduring, giving. The air smelled of damp earth and distant pine, a reminder that life moved forward, indifferent to grudges, resentments, or the echo of past indignities. For the first time in decades, I felt the clarity of action aligned with intention. I had acted decisively, not out of spite, but out of necessity, out of the need to protect what mattered most. The letter had spoken. The law had followed. The home was empty of those who would not honor it. And in the quiet aftermath, there was relief, a gentle light that filled the spaces left by chaos and cruelty. I stayed on the porch for a long while, watching the fog curl and lift across the marsh, letting the stillness embrace me. The house was silent, the marsh was silent, and for the first time, I could breathe without apology, without vigilance, without expectation. Closure had come not through conflict, but through calm, deliberate action. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't known in years. Peace. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke from distant chimneys. A year had passed since the house on Whitaker Street had emptied, since the final paperwork had been signed and my parents had moved out. I found myself at the community center, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked under a simple scarf, ladling stew into waiting bowls. The room was bustling, warm with the chatter of volunteers and the soft hum of holiday music in the background. A small hand reached for mine, tugging gently. "You remind me of my grandma," said a child. Shy but smiling, eyes wide and earnest. I laughed softly, the sound light and unburdened. She beamed, nodding seriously as if the comparison was a great honor. I realized then that connection didn't need to be earned through bloodlines. It could be chosen, nurtured, extended outward to those who had none. Around me, people moved with purpose, setting tables, pouring drinks, offering blankets to the weary. I watched as strangers greeted one another, exchanging stories, laughter bubbling freely in a way that felt honest and unpolished. There was warmth here, a quiet reciprocity I hadn't known in years, the kind that comes not from expectation, but from mutual care. I caught the eye of another volunteer, a young man who had been serving plates all afternoon. He nodded, a brief smile that said he recognized the effort behind each gesture. I nodded back. It was enough. There was no judgment, no demand, only acknowledgement of shared humanity. I stepped outside for a moment, the chill pressing against my face, the night sky scattered with faint stars, the streetlights reflected on the wet pavement, and the world seemed vast and quiet, holding possibilities I hadn't let myself consider before. I thought of Marianne, of my parents, of Janine. And then I thought of this room, the laughter, the clatter, the simple gratitude of people who didn't know me from yesterday, but were willing to share their space. It struck me that family was not confined to blood, inheritance, or shared history. It could be chosen, built with intention, and cherished for what it gave, not for what it demanded. I returned inside, hands still warm from the ladle, and watched the child take another bite of stew, smiling up at me again. There was joy in that recognition, fleeting but real. I smiled, letting it settle into the corners of my heart, a small, steady light that promised continuity. For the first time in a long while, Christmas felt like home. Weeks later, the post brought a small envelope, the kind with uneven edges and slightly creased corners, as if it had been carried carefully and then set aside for a long moment before delivery. I held it in my hands, turning it slowly, noting the familiar loops of Marianne's handwriting, hesitant, uneven, the kind that spoke of pause and thought. Inside, there was a short note, a few sentences folded over themselves like careful steps. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't understand before. I see now what you've carried all these years." And tucked beneath it, a photograph Marianne, smiling softly, holding the small ornament I had made for her when she was 5, the faded paint, the chipped edges, the ribbon fraying slightly. It was the same one I had carefully packed every Christmas, a tiny relic of our earliest celebrations. I placed the photograph beside my candle on the mantel, letting the gentle light touch both the paper and the glass of the ornament. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting the quiet fill the room, the warmth of the flame casting shadows that danced lightly across the walls. I felt the weight of years ease from my shoulders, not entirely gone, but softened, acknowledged. Slowly, I rose and walked to the porch, hand brushing the railing, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingers. Outside, the fog of early evening clung low over the marsh, the air thick and still. I switched on the porch light, the small bulb glowing steady and unwavering, casting a golden pool onto the steps. It wasn't a signal to anyone, nor a call for attention. It was a marker of presence, of enduring care, of quiet strength. I leaned against the railing, letting the light spill across the porch and settle over the path ahead, and whispered to the evening, There's always room for forgiveness, just not for cruelty. For the first time in years, I felt both closure and grace without compromise. The past remained, but the weight had shifted. The lessons were learned, the boundaries maintained, the love careful, deliberate, resilient still intact. I glanced back at the photograph, at the ornament, at the candlelight. In that soft illumination, I understood something fundamental when love stops begging for a seat. When it ceases to plead for recognition or approval, it builds its own table, steady and enduring, and invites only those who will honor its presence.